The paradigm for this was undoubtedly Ballard's childhood in Shanghai. The privileged child of wealthy British expatriate parents, he grew up in the 1930s in a white European enclave, but made forays into a dangerous city that, far from terrifying, exhilarated him.
Shanghai was really created by Americans and Western Europeans in its modern form in the 20s and 30s, and it was advanced in every conceivable way. I mean, the house we had wasn't a particularly spectacular house, had air conditioning and double glazing and, you know, huge American-style kitchens and bathrooms and all this sort of thing. Everybody owned American cars, as a matter of course. And, of course, there were absolutely no restraints on life in Shanghai. There were, I think at one stage, in the 30s, there was something like 400 nightclubs in the city. It was described as the wickedest city in the world, the Paris of the Orient. It was unlimited entrepreneurial venture capitalism carried to the nth point, and I adored it. I thought it was exciting and a collision of all these different cultures. That's why I've always believed in, you know, in sort of multiracial societies and the hottest possible ethnic mix. I think it produces excitement. From a very early age, I was quite sort of devious. And I used to tell my nanny, or my mother at the age of 7 or 8, this is in the late 30s, that I was popping round the corner to see some friends of mine who lived further up Amherst Avenue. And instead I would get on my bike, a small, you know, half-sized little bike, and set off for downtown Shanghai through this sort of maelstrom of trams and trucks and huge American cars, thousands of rickshaws and pedestrians, a place full of gangsters and pickpockets, beggars on the sidewalks.
And full of danger, really, for the boy of a rich man.
Yes, yes, it was. It was a miracle. There were a lot of kidnappings. I mean, my father kept an automatic pistol among his shirts in the wardrobe in his bedroom, which I used to enjoy playing with when they, from an early age, when my parents went out in the evening. A miracle I didn't shoot myself. That was a violent place. Dead Chinese were commonplace on the streets of Shanghai. Most had died from disease and famine, of course, but it was a tremendously brutal place.
The young Ballard strikes me as an ebullient character, defined as much by his enthusiasms as his emotions. However, unlike most people, he retained these enthusiasms into adulthood. It's impossible not to thrill to the note of glee in Ballard's voice when he hymns Shanghai, its modernity, its arms outspread to joyfully embrace the American century. Yet his childhood was also an almost comical throwback to 19th century upper-middle-class British moors. The big house, the servants, the prep school.
I went to a cathedral school in Shanghai, and we had this fierce disciplinarian who was the headmaster, a Church of England clergyman, and he used to set enormous numbers of lines for the smallest infraction. Sort of looking out of the window, you'd get 500 lines, and you were expected to, copy out great chunks of G.A. Henty, who wrote, very morally uplifting Victorian adventure stories for boys. And I was painfully, writing out the 10th page of one of these, and I suddenly thought, I'll make it up. It's faster. I don't have to look at Henty's text, which I started doing until one day the headmaster looked at me and said, next time you copy out your lines, don't pick some trashy adventure story. Well, I was set for life.
Ballard speaking on Radio 2 in 2006 and describing his eureka moment. So, a self-confessedly devious child who felt a degree of distance from those around him and whose imagination was already burgeoning. Characteristics that might well have made him a writer, whatever his surroundings. But then...
My first intact memories really date from 1937, when the Japanese invaded China and all of Shanghai except for the international settlement. And there was tremendously bitter fighting in and around the city. I don't ever remember being frightened. I think it was because we lived very protected lives as the children of Westerners in Shanghai. If I was moving around the city, as it were, officially, I traveled everywhere in my parents' car with a chauffeur.
Ballard, talking on a bookmark special, Shanghai Jim, in 1991. But after the Japanese took Shanghai, there was no more chauffeur, only a period of confusion and anarchy, before Ballard and his family, together with thousands of others, found themselves loaded onto trucks, then driven out to the hinterland of Shanghai, where they were interned in camps. There, the Westerners would wait out the remainder of the war, or else sicken, languish, and then die.
This room was the room that my mother and father, sister and I shared for nearly 3 years. It was so crowded, in fact, that during the day my father, who slept there, raised his mattress against the wall so that we had a little space where we could put up a card table and eat our meals. Otherwise, there was just a door's width between the beds. I slept over there, my mother there, and my sister there. In many ways, this is the most important place in my life. There's no question about it. I came to puberty here. I left the camp when I was about 15, and I came to something close to an adult mind in this camp. I saw, of course, adults under a great deal of stress, which was an education in itself. I mean, this little room is, in fact, probably as close as I'll ever come to home, surprisingly. So many of the moments in my novels and short stories only made sense if they were seen in terms of an attempt to sort of recreate Shanghai.
An uncharacteristically emotional Ballard, standing in the tiny cubicle where he lived throughout the war, his normally bluff and genial manner like a guard dropping to reveal the distressed, disoriented and traumatized boy. The boy who, to some extent, he must always have remained. How else to explain the way that this outwardly peaceable man was able so effectively to realize the psychopathology of violence in his fiction? The scenes Ballard witnessed during the Japanese occupation of China were seared into his psyche, and he returned to them again and again. In 2006, he told me about the Chinese coolie he had seen beaten to death by Japanese soldiers in front of his eyes and those of his parents. But it was a horror dote I was already familiar with, from Empire of the Sun, from The Kindness of Women, and it would make another reappearance in his memoir, Miracles of Life, published last year. Here's the 1984 version.
The soldiers began to saunter around the upended rickshaw. Private Kimura kicked its wheels, shattering the spokes. The others stamped on the wooden handles and snapped the shafts. Together they threw the vehicle onto its back, scattering the cushions. The coolie knelt on the ground, laughing to himself. In the silence, Jim could hear the strange sing-song that the Chinese made when they knew they were about to be killed. Around the parade ground, the hundreds of prisoners watched without moving. Men and women sat in makeshift deck chairs outside the barrack huts or stood on the steps of the dormitory blocks. The lungwa players paused in their rehearsal. None of them spoke as the Japanese soldiers strolled around the rickshaw, kicking its seats and framework into matchwood. From the locker below the seat fell a bundle of rags, a tin pail, a cotton bag filled with rice, and a Chinese newspaper. The entire worldly possessions of the illiterate coolie. He sat among the grains of rice scattered on the ground and began to sing at a higher note, raising his face to the sky. Jim smoothed the pages of the Reader's Digest, wondering whether to read an article about Winston Churchill. He would have liked to leave, but all around him the prisoners were motionless as they watched the parade ground. The Japanese turned their attention to the coolie. Raising their staves, they each struck him a blow on the head and then strolled away as if deep in thought. Breathlessly now, the coolie sang to himself as the blood ran from his back and formed a pool around his knees.
When Empire of the Sun came out, there were those who had been interned with Ballard who questioned the veracity of his account. He had, they said, been with his parents, and yet his fictional alter ego, Jim, was alone in the camp. To me, Ballard said,